Okay, let's see if it's working today. Let's see if it's going here. Hello, hello. Oh, hey. Got a lot of people to jump on quick. It's good to see y'all. I'm in a strange weekend for me, so I'm trying to play catch up a little bit. I have something in mind I want to do today. Probably should take a look at this first, I guess. So this bottom is, I'm calling it a bottom because it looks very bottom-like to me. So you have a chance that it could come back down, like after earnings, for example. You know, we see these kind of rebounds quite often on AMC where you get this really harsh push back to the upside to go test a level. It's called an auto reaction in Hycroft terms. This one is a little different because the volume on it. So if you look at like the last example of something like this, maybe right here, and you compare it to where we are now, that's some like eyeglasses. It's like a bicycle. It's kind of the same. Like both have a. All right, so here's where I should start. Like there's some pretty distinct differences. So like one of the things that's kind of obvious to me is anytime I'm looking at a bottom or something like that, I always try to check decently high time frame, something like RSI, because for example, like you might think, oh, that's a bottom, and really you're only at like the 50 on RSI, and like there's so much more room. This one's a little different. We've been scraping the bottom for a while. I would say that this looks divergent. I could be wrong, but it looks divergent to me, and that tells me that this could be a good sign. You know, and it's AMC, so grain of salt, as always. Talk a little bit about IWM as well. I think it's important today to talk about it because it's in a place where we want to see, which chart is it? I think it was over here with the charge. ChargePoint drove off a cliff, no pun intended, because it's an EV manufacturer. I still think I know you guys are like, why is this guy still talking about this stock? I don't know what it is about it. I just have this really strong feeling that EV manufacturing type, there's like 3 or 4 that are pretty well known. This is one of them. This one just to me feels like it's bleeding out, but it's doing this kind of like shallow S-curvy thing that we see. And if it finishes it's kind of like, oh, it's going to go bankrupt or something, you know, like, oh, it's going to come all the way down to like nothing, pennies on the dollar. But if it doesn't, I think it's going to have a mad violent reaction back up to the 4s. And I feel the same way about AMC in a lot of ways. The charts are oddly similar. They're really similar. If you look at the upthrust, like way back here in June, and you compare that to what happened at ChargePoint in the same time period, they're really similar. If you look at the patterning on the charts, almost identical. It's kind of creepy. Isn't it weird? Like I think that's super strange. I can put them side by side, but I'll just do it like this. And I have this, I don't know why. So I'm not saying that they're the same. The companies are obviously different, completely different sectors. But to me, it looks like the same operators. Could be the same short operators, but they're uncanny how similar they are. So on the left-hand side of the screen is ChargePoint, that's CHPT, and on the right side is AMC. And you can see there's a really distinctively sort of similar smell to them both, right? And the reason that I keep talking about it is also because like EV manufacturing is only increasing, like electronic vehicles. That's what I'm saying, EV. And I know that there's big names like Tesla that are trying to get into creating like charge stations, and that's what ChargePoint does. ChargePoint is like the biggest one by area, meaning like they have the most coverage right now. It's kind of like, in my opinion, I'm not saying it's the same thing as exactly the same thing as this, but it's kind of like if you were betting on AC versus DC current back in the day, you know, when they started laying power lines. I feel like it's something like that. Like the infrastructure for electronic vehicles, I don't care if you like them or not. That's not what I'm here to talk about. But the infrastructure for electronic vehicles is being built right now. So you're kind of like putting if in my opinion, you're kind of putting money, if you're buying these stocks, you're putting money into these like kind of racehorses, that which one do you think is going to kind of win out in the end. And we know that a lot of startup companies, or a lot of companies that start up with these kinds of things, they don't make it, right? Like one of them ends up being the top dog. It's not always a Pepsi and Coke scenario where they share the marketplace. You know, if you ever seen that movie, I can't remember what it was called. There was the movie about the AC versus DC current, and it was about Tesla, I think, and the other guy, Edison. Anyways, they don't both win out, right? So like sometimes the business doesn't give you like a freebie, but I find it very, very odd that this is one of those stocks that it has this very uncanny similarity to AMC. Really, really bizarre to me anyways. And value-wise, I know it doesn't look quite the same, but it's lost as much value. I mean, it really has. Maybe AMC's lost more value, I would argue, but they're really similar charts, right? So one of the benefits of that is that as I'm studying ChargePoint, sometimes I'm like seeing things and I'm like, I wonder if that's the same for AMC, and I go check it. And sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. Like one example is this downtrend, you know, like is that downtrend present on AMC? And the answer is kind of, you know, it's not quite the same. And I think that that's where you start getting into sort of some interesting conversations about, you know, how are these moving, and like what are maybe what the operators are trying to get to in the end. Are they really doing this massive S-curve to bring them down to pennies? We'll find out, right? Or is it more about this kind of shallow S-curve where we've kind of made the bottom and now we're just kind of pressing down as far as we can until we get that really solid auto reaction? And why am I talking about all this right now? What does that have to do with anything? Well, the shallow S-curve is a very bizarre term. It might make you kind of confused if you don't know what I'm talking about, because you're like, never heard that before. Is that a real thing? Not really. It's just a way that I'm using language to describe something that I've seen. So like a normal S-curve, if you had like a 50% mark, let's say this is the 50% at the red line, a normal S-curve would probably level off around 50% and then drop down. And oftentimes we've noticed, just as a matter of observation, that you get those two platforms. They're like cat ears, basically. You get those two platforms right in the middle, and then it drops down. But the shallow S-curve is a little different. It does the same thing, but oftentimes it goes like much flatter, and then it doesn't actually go down all the way. It kind of like stops short, and usually there's a big auto reaction, and then it kind of does some kind of an M cross, and then it continues. The first time that I saw something like this and I decided to call it a shallow S-curve was back in the very, very, I mean, it's kind of a hard sell right now because I'm like, how do you even like look at that? But it was way back here, and it's really small. It was a small fractal. A fractal is just a pattern of bars that repeats inside of itself. But this is one that was right before the takeoff And what happened was in March of 2022. I can draw it out for you really quick, but basically what happened is that we had a push up and then we had a cat ear like distribution, and it was a push up above like a previous level when we had come down. Most people will remember this. I'm talking about this area right here. We came down and there was like all this craziness down here, and then it pushed up slowly and like an ascending accumulation until we got to the end, and there was like a final push. And the ascending accumulation looked a little bit like it was going to straight up just go parabolic. And I'm drawing it out, but this is almost exactly the way it looked like. I know it's so silly. The drop sort of comes back down and forms like a channel. And this is where I first saw that shallow S-curve. It was like it was going to meet something, and it had the initial drop. There was a decent little auto reaction, and then there was a shallow S-curve, and then it reverses. And this is where you get this huge jump over a creek line. And so I know it's kind of like a doodle, but that's almost exactly what that bars pattern looked like, basically. And because I looked at this a lot. I used to think that this was kind of like one of those bread and butter things, and it is for ascending accumulations. But then that final push, that's what gave me, if you're wondering, that's what gave me this entry right here. So this looks like, okay, that's cool, but how often did that really happen? This looks like something that you maybe see every once in a while. No, it actually happens on every single takeoff. Like, we have multiple examples of that final pullback. There's one right here, right before the takeoff that happened in January. There was a small one right here. Obviously, it's hard to see that one. There is a little one right here. It doesn't really do much. You could count this larger one, but this is where I used to describe things very differently before a bigger push. There's definitely one here, and there's a shallow S-curve right inside of here, if you want to go look. And then one of the ones that's kind of obvious that I've been talking about is this guy, and I talk about this one quite a bit as well. And this one has that top, just like we see over here, where it pushes a previous level, and then it draws back until it finds support. And what's bizarre is this could look like a breakdown, but what it doesn't do is it never crosses back below whatever prevailing creek. So in this case, you can see like there was a creek. I'm going to zoom in. You see it better. You can see that there was a creek here, meaning like these are the highs. This was pushed up. This was pushed up. So it made a higher high here, then it makes lower lows, and then it starts reversing, because you can see that from here to here, this like comes up higher again. So these two end up being your creek points, and you can see that this doesn't ever lose it. But the top right up here is distributive. Like it hits a top, and then it reverses, and it goes all the way back down, and it comes down really low. But maybe one of the easier ways to kind of see it is to draw it like a trend. And when you see that, you're kind of like, oh, okay. So it went parabolic upward towards the top of that trend. Maybe one way to describe it. As it crossed this bigger creek, and then it does the pullback. And probably there's like a double whammy here. I mean, it does a creek check, and it hits the bottom of this trend at the same time. What I'm saying is there's this really small fractal, and it's exactly the same. And it does the same exact thing here, right before the takeoff, right before the big push. And this was probably the best entry I ever got on AMC ever. Like, it just was. I made a ton of money on this that I then lost because I held my shares instead of selling most of them. But that's not the point. The point is, because that's already happened, right? Can't go back in time. You can't fix that. But it is what it is. Like, this was definitely the most lucrative trade I've made, and it was because I recognized that pattern. So why am I talking about that? Well, in all those cases, I wouldn't say that there was a shallow S-curve here, but when you get to the bottom, the patterning that I noticed on this bottom back in, this was really July into August of 2022, that patterning I noticed was the pattern that I've been talking about like nonstop on here the last 3 or 4 months. When it hits the bottom, there's a strong reaction, and then it does like that cat ear thing, and then it tries to drop again. And we see this pattern all over the place, right? Like we see it here, we see it, you know, as it comes down. This is like your cat ear S curve down. We see it back here. Interestingly, in this area in August of 2022, it doesn't make a lower low. And so it made it like a really easy buy-in. That particular fractal never comes down again. So if you look at the very bottom here in that area, you'll see that instead of dropping to a new low, like a lot of these distributions do, it actually stays up high. Like this initial push was much lower. This makes a higher high and then starts continuing back up. It was a super easy buy-in because as soon as it crossed this creek, I was like, that's it. It's really bullish. It's going to fly. And it did. It was a simple read. The thing is that a lot of times that's not the way it works out for us. A lot of times we get that S curve and we end up dropping really low. And I've been talking about this quite a bit because I think that this whole gigantic scenario that we have going on is pretty much that fractal. Like it's pretty much that pattern. And if you don't like the word fractal, I don't really mind because I don't like the word either very much. Not anymore. It gets overused. One way to describe it is a repeating pattern. And fractals are not mythical things that this community made up. They're on official, like, you know, you can go like Investopedia and look them up. They're mathematical terms for repeating patterns, like patterns that are made up of the patterns themselves. It's a bit confusing. It makes a lot of sense in an algorithmic era of trading that we would see a lot of that kind of stuff. And while I don't think, I don't necessarily think, somebody just brought up a point, Carly, I think, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce your name, but I don't necessarily think it's over, like it can't possibly go down again. I do think that this particular move might be finishing because this is that S curve. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's what this is. It's like it's like perfect, right? And my bigger question has been lately, is this a shallow S curve or is this a full S curve? And if the full S curve is going to $1, like that's the measurement. It's a perfect measurement. And it's not pleasant, but that's what it is. Because, you know, you could take it and measure it out yourself. And you can see that right where that 50% mark is, right here where we landed, is exactly where, you know, that first ear happens, if you want to call it that. That's halfway to $1 from the top. So it's not meant to be necessarily predictive, more descriptive. Is absolutely, if it's a shallow S curve, we're never going to get there. And I think that some of them are, but some of them aren't, right? I mean, you just kind of like don't know until you're there, and you're looking for natural places to stop. There's a lot of fib levels down here that people have pointed out in the 2s and 3s. And I did an analysis. Let's see if I can find it again. I think it was just on the other side of this one. Sorry. I did an analysis last week on sine waves, and it was 190 to 230s. And I think that was a pretty accurate way to describe it. Right now, I would say that all we're doing is really whipping around that center mark. And ultimately, like, it could always come back down. Like, it could stop here, especially because there's a creek right above us. I know it's hard to see. This is a messier chart. I never really cleaned it up. It's almost exactly as it was left on that stream. But this is the two outer peaks here before the drops. And you can see that we're approaching it, haven't quite jumped it yet. And then that orange line is the big one, like the big rotation that we're currently on. It's like the larger one. And we haven't crossed through that middle yet. So we've been kind of stuck. And that's where I'm at today, is that I was thinking about it and I was like, you know, one thing I didn't do is I didn't really do any kind of comparison because probably would give us a lot of information to find out if we see this shallow S curve quite often, and I think we do, then why can't we, identify a pattern for that final push? Because, I mean, if that's what we want to see happen, then we should be able to identify it, right? I think the easiest place to do, or excuse me, the easiest way to do that would probably be to draw a local creek like this. Like basically it hits most of the major touch points. I'm ignoring that first push over here since we already know that was a trap going into earnings. That one, and you could do another one with that included, and that's kind of where we are now. I think if it jumped over that, sure, it'd be enough to say, yeah, I could have a push to a higher level, because then you're talking about a resistance that's no longer a resistance. It's pretty simple. So that would be at a level around $4 now, pushing up to about 4, finding support in like 380 and then going. So if you want the short of it, that's probably where I would stop. You don't think you necessarily need to go any further, but what I want to do today is I want to try to go back as far as I can. And I know that TradingView limits like how far back you can go. And so there's two main sections I want to check out. We might find more, but there's at least one that I really want to see what this looks like. And I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do this with extended hours on. So let me see if I can change, because usually you get even less information with extended hours. Just depends. Yeah, we might be able to go back. So we can go back and look at a number of these and determine whether or not, like, was this a shallow S-curve? Meh. Was this a shallow S-curve? Probably, you know. This one definitely was right here, but it also, as you can see, even though it has that massive upthrust, it didn't break back above that creek. So on the micro level, it doesn't ultimately add up to a bigger move. But it is a big move right here. So this is an example of one. And again, like, I know that the setups going into them are kind of different. So you might look at that and say, oh, it's totally different, Booksy. Maybe. Maybe not. You know, in a lot of ways, these things are all kind of the same. And I don't think this is necessarily like a fractal thing. I think this is just, you know, hey, this is the way that it's worked out a couple different times. So this could easily be seen as a January into June move. You know, it creates a bottom. There's a buy-in. Then there's a January move, which is kind of like the middle of an S-curve. Right? There's a pullback, it finds support, and then there's the June move. And then you have a pretty distinctive looking distribution cycle. And obviously after that, maybe we could say, yeah, it doesn't really work out anymore. It doesn't look the same. But nonetheless, isn't this where we were, you know, on the big picture when we were going sideways? We were kind of like right across from January. So even though, like, I know that in my mind, a lot of these things are not one-to-one, I do think that the similarities are worth investigating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide like everything. So I can just do the fractal stuff. I'm going to call this sine waves so I don't forget. We're going to probably want to come back to that later. And this one and this one are both locked. I'm going to put them in sine wave and hide them. Yeah, so you might say, like, yeah, that's not really the same thing. I don't 100% disagree. I really don't. But what I would say is that the you know, the levels that we're talking about are pretty similar. You know, you've got a similar setup in regards to how it's moving. It doesn't really make a huge difference to me that the levels aren't perfectly one-to-one. Again, I'm not really interested in trying to pretend like a fractal has to do this or has to do that. Obviously, this is way steeper. But there might be some things that you can kind of glean from it, and that's why I think it's worth investigating and doing this way. So one thing is, like, what's the relationship between these two regions? At first, it doesn't really seem like there is much of one, right? But you'll notice that as this works its way back up, there's the challenge that this was obviously rising, whereas this was falling. We're talking about the smaller fractal here was rising into a buy-in versus this falling here. Maybe that's not the best example then, but what we could do is look at it and say, okay, well, let's say, for example, that you decided that, all right, Booksy, I like this, but I really don't think that's the best example. Why don't you start with the falling? Because you could go way back to here and say, like, I think, well, if this is your buy-in down bottom, shouldn't it all be included? And the answer is yeah. And I don't think that it really matters how you do it, because either way you do it, the M cross is still there right in the middle. So it's the same exact point. It's just happening like, on a different scale. So on the one hand, you could look at this and say, I'm going to look at this fractal as this falls. And then at the other hand, you could look back and you could say, well, I think, I'm going to look at this one as this falls. This looks pretty similar to what we're experiencing as well. And I think both would be valid comparisons. So I don't really feel like it has to be like a perfect fit. There's another one that I'm going to look at that I think will be better. But this is one that I want to kind of see just to see it. So there doesn't seem to be like any reason why this went as low as it went here, at least upon the initial look. Like maybe it's setting up for something else later. What we could do is take a look at where it takes off. That seems pretty important. And it's fairly straightforward. It's like once this comes back up and it meets again, the previous bottom, the floor here, that was established. Then you get that, we might even call it a shoulder here. And that's fine, but it's a pretty big upthrust. And where does it go? This is not really a mystery. We just talked about it a minute ago. On the rise, it's kind of coming up from this trend. Again, we could kind of argue about where that trend should be placed. I think that using that final support and then that very first support might be good. If you use the outer ones, I think it just shows where this breaks down eventually. Either way, this looks pretty familiar to me. So once again, it's kind of like, yeah, I don't know. Either way, you do this, it kind of cuts the same way. If you use this steeper one over here, you kind of get the same answer. So where is that? I'm not 100% sure, but I think that even if we were looking at this like in a real negative way, like we were like, oh, it has to be these 2 points, these bottom 2 points, which kind of go down, maybe downward, you'd still have a retracement back up at some point to that mark. But going a little further, you could go back and say, well, what about the other thing we talked about with that breakdown? And yeah, I mean, that was what we mentioned over here. Like we see this same pattern appear all over the place, and you get that similar kind of breakdown, and then it eventually comes back up to check this top. And we're going to have to sort of do our own, let's just say determining on which one is probably better. I mean, right now, everyone's going to be saying probably the lower one because, we don't feel very confident about AMC right now. It's basically just a flat line. I mean, it's slightly downward, but yeah, I mean, it would take you back to $8 or $9 for sure. When I look back at this whole schematic, I find that to be fairly agreeable, although, one might argue that, hey, I think that's, if you look at this small example, that doesn't make any sense. This goes way higher. Yeah. In the end, there's so many different comparisons you can do here. You just kind of have to decide which one you think is the most important. I think this one is probably the most important in this particular example. I know I've got these other curves, but you can see that the intersection is clearly where they're going. So you have an uptrend. You have this particular top, which is where your breakdown happened in the middle before this shallow S-curve starts, and it looks like we're going back up to check that breakdown. We never checked it. Sounds familiar, right? Where is that breakdown on our current chart? It's way up here at like $42. So if I were to say like, which one do I think is the most important? Yeah, we've been repeating January 2021 for 2 years. So this is the reason why fractals can be really dangerous, because every single time we come down, it might be a repetition of that, but I can point to you, I'm telling you right now, like January 2021, that is another shallow S curve. So when you look at these and you're going to be primed to say like, I want the big one, it's better just to look at it and just learn what that pattern is doing. Like, where is the goal, because I see that shallow S curve right here as well, going down into January of 2021. 100% agree with that. I think it's there. But I also think it's, all these other places that I marked off. So we've got a half a dozen that we could look at. And they're not all the same. They do not end up... 31, mid next week. That'd be cool. It's not impossible. But it would be something else, right? That'd be crazy. So this particular move, I think this is safe enough to say that, yeah, if I had to gander, like, all right, where eventually would this go back to? And we're looking at this and we're looking at it in fairness, like all kind of the same way, and we're trying to determine like where would this go and how does it get there and all this jazz. I think it makes sense that the stuff that we've been talking about as a matter of observation have probably been about right. Somewhere over here. And I've pointed out that this could be as late as 2025, but that this would be your general place of interest. One thing I don't have on here is I don't have a moving average. So I'm going to see if I can get a... Let's do 180. We're doing this on the 30-minute compared to the daily. Yeah, but see this? This also makes a case that you wouldn't need to come that high necessarily. It's arguable. So this comes up above that, and that would be like us coming up above. Again, it's a light comparison. Don't take it too seriously. That would be like us coming just above probably this $9 mark, which seems to be where this EMA is going right now, and then like kind of stalling out above it, maybe up to like 20 something. That would be that first gap. Probably, if I'm not mistaken, that was like the other target we got the other day. That would be something like this, like right in the middle of that range. So that makes sense. Makes sense to me. Then this also probably adds up to be quite a decent 50-50 if you did draw it out. So like, for example, let's say we were expecting it to be like January where it goes up and then goes up again. Could that be like a 50-50 move? Yeah. And you see the 50% at 12, and then the top's at like 58. Cool. So if, for example, that is what we were expecting on a rebound, I think it would be prudent to do a quick analysis here on this trend. I'm going to make it a different color. Let's make it yellow. You probably can't see yellow any differently at home. Let's just do blue. I like the blue color. Let's go back in time. Oh, wow, look at that. So that's probably a big part of the reaction right now is that we hit the all-time, I mean, that's kind of ugly how perfect that is. We hit the all-time trend. So the stock price opened way back here. This is one of those things where you're like, yeah, duh, Boxy, that's why we bounced. Well, if you go way back in time, it hit the first low we ever made. Now it says 101. Passed through the bottom we made here, 10, which is not actually the lowest point, but it's the outermost point, if that makes sense. If there was like going to be a creek, that would be it. And it looks like we just kind of bounced right off of it. So... okay, what else? Let's take a look. Let's take a look at just like prevailing trends. So this is an obvious one. So this is the outermost prevailing trend here. Do I think it's the best one? Maybe. I mean, it's okay. You can tell that like once it got above there seems to be a little bit more interest in buying right here. You can see there's like a big push up right after it jumps the creek. My guess is, and I'm not going to, stumble my way through it, but my guess is this is very similar to that pattern I just talked about with the parabolic move and then the pullback. But I'm not going to try to dance around that. It's more about, for our sake, it's more about just kind of setup. But yeah, I like this. That makes sense to me. Let's see if there's another one. So sometimes I'll use that very far outer point. Sometimes I'll use this one because this final move is really a fake out. You can see it in the volume. It's the up thrust after distribution. And oftentimes this previous move is a lot higher. So it's another good one to use. And I actually think that one's better. So notice how when I go to that, it brings this trend up higher. And now it's actually meeting that mark and that mark. So I actually think this one's better. Yeah, the higher one works a lot better, in my opinion. Yeah, so this would be the challenge right now is like, well, where would that mark be, you know? Like, how do you even find that, Booksy? That's a good question. Is it way up here, you know, in September? Is it this push up in March? It's really hard to say. None of that really looks exactly the same. So you can make guesses. I guess we could try this one and just see what that looks like. I think that's a pretty solid line. I've drawn this one before, but this one seems to be one of the strongest ones that we have. So if you look back at this trend, and I'll make it really bright blue, I don't think it's 1-to-1. I think it's similar. This one's pretty strong. It does not, though, do what we're seeing on this trend. So like that doesn't really help with any kind of comparison. The other one I would do is this guy, and I've done this one quite a bit. And this is the one I was talking about not 10 minutes ago, I think. We were talking about the orange line. This is the orange line. So this one actually meets it, crosses, and then drops beneath it, and then we get so it meets it here, crosses, drops beneath, and then we get this kind of what's the word? Ricocheting, right? Back and forth off this wall, and then eventually we're kind of back to it again. We're right there. So both of these would probably be like what I would consider to be like the big midlines, if you want to call them that. And my guess is that we're going to find that that's a common theme. This is very similar to what we did last week, which was those sine waves, in which case you'd at least be coming over the top of this one soon. And if it's a shallow S-curve, you should get a pretty explosive move back up to 10. And then we'll see, right? If it really is a shallow S-curve. All right, another thing we might want to look at is the relationship between this area and the S-curve. Because in this case, there's a breakdown, right? And you can see that where the S-curve kind of starts is right here. I know this is a little sloppy looking, but it's definitely there. You can see that there's a support here originally, and then when we finally leave that support behind, there's two places. One is there, but one is also right here, and those end up being like kind of where I would say your ears are. Ear 1, probably ear 2, and then down again. Yeah, and that's your low. And then you notice that when we take off, this ends up being the support after it's pressed. So that doesn't bode really well for what we're talking about, because if that's the case, that support would basically be, well, I wouldn't say it's awful, but I would say it's not the best. And this just goes to show that it's kind of drastically different, right? So if I had used fractals to try to measure this, probably would have been wrong, right? And I thought we might get that rebound back up to the top. We never did. So again, it's kind of like, well, where would you end up? And then how would you find out if it's going to continue? You probably would need to stay above this level. It's that simple. And this one doesn't look like it's going to break down at first, and then it does. As soon as this breaks beneath that level, you can see it's just like the bear game, you know? Like, okay, we're still going down, and then they just continue. There's massive volume on this breakdown afterwards, right here. This is when bears, like once again, I know there's the moving average, but it's really this double tap on this line, and you can see the volume surge. And it doesn't make any difference, at least on a 30-minute time frame, how low that RSI is. It just keeps going down. So that's one example. We could look at the larger I would call it an S-curve or whatever. We could look at the larger one right here. This one also looks pretty similar to what we're experiencing. It's not exactly the same. We know that ultimately this comes up, and it actually, funny enough, hits that same mark eventually. That ends up being a really critical level. And going back, it's not hard to see why that might be a critical level. You know, it's an important marker. It probably has a Fibonacci significance. I'm not going to check it, but it's probably like a fib level or something. This reaction only comes up to that point, and that would be like us coming up to check this gap that we left at like 980. So once again, we're kind of running in circles. Like we basically already knew that this was target 1, and that's roughly 980. So we didn't get a different target from that, but we got it again. So that's something. So at least in these two fractals, one's really small, one's a lot bigger, you got the same exact thing. And if you really want to go further and say like, hey, this is just a giant expansion and it's doing it all over again and again and again, you know, we can go back here and look, where did this hit? Probably hit the same mark in the after hours when this thing pushed up. So once again, it comes back to that same level, you know, and so it's repeated in like the small here, the larger here, and then the largest. This is the frustration of any kind of fractal junk, though, is that you might think that the fractal's over and you're really in like a setup that's kind of doing the same thing over and over again, which is not really pleasant. So that's like this one, and then I would even argue you could make an argument that it's this larger one as well. And then ultimately, like, they're just doing the same things, repeating. You know, eventually it hits that mark up here. So this is a pretty straightforward comparison to some shallow S-curves. I don't know exactly what we're going to find, but I'm going to use different examples because I don't want to be like super biased and just pick out bull examples. Thus far, here's what my thoughts are. I think we hit like an all-time trend, which makes sense. It's made by the lowest lows. So the original low that was made like 2 days after AMC opened, and then the low from the March drop right here. And that trend, so it goes all the way back to the beginning. That trend has apparently caused some kind of reaction, right? And now we'd be looking at, well, where does it go from here? You know what I mean? Potentially. And I'm looking at different shallow S-curves. I'm just doing like a simple comparison. It's a proportional comparison. So I'm looking at the markers on one and the markers on the other and just seeing where are they going back to test. We're not really getting much new information, but maybe that's a good thing, you know? Because if you're getting repeated information, that could be positive. That could be a positive sign that, yeah, this is pretty consistent. I wanted to look at this one, but I don't feel like it's the best. It's more of a full S-curve, and I don't want to get confused. Because this one's the March one, and I like it here at the very end, the small one, but I don't like the larger picture. I think it's a bit confusing. It just doesn't look the same. This one's one that I really want to take a look at in a little more detail. To me, this one represents kind of like the beginning of where I started seeing those patterns, I guess, and how they appeared. And there's some ways of looking at this that might be a little bit skewed. But what I want to do is we're not going to really focus on the shallow S-curve as much as we will just this setup here and how it could relate to what we're dealing with right now. Obviously, this eventually comes up and goes beyond this particular high. And this is during a downtrend. So you might say, well, why don't you use this? And I'd used this comparison back in this area because I think it's the same fractal. And then I think we went low and it dropped and yada, yada, yada. But again, in terms of like creeks and lines and all that jazz that we're going to look at, I think it'll probably be a very similar comparison. So that's why I want to do it. So this one has some pretty clear markings of that M cross, as we call it. It's also got the key level that it eventually takes off from. You can see there's the breakdown level right here. There's a backup that occurs. It's a very mild backup, but there's a mild backup that occurs. And you can see that this is kind of like pinned in by the where that original kind of bottom was. You can see right here these two levels. And I didn't draw that other line, but I'll go ahead and draw it. So once again, like this has a reaction that's much more, I don't want to say low key, but it's a lot more subtle maybe than we would like, because it doesn't immediately jump and then just kind of ramp up. It just takes a lot of time to kind of make its way across, and once it does, then it pushes off. I think all in all, this wasn't like a huge amount of time. It was a few weeks, but it was like 30 days or something. I don't remember. I could look at the thing and like find out, but yeah, so we could take that same thing and just sort of like pin it out the same way. It's hard for me to see where this secondary line would be because there's not really any indication anywhere that it should be. This is all we have right here. There's one right here, and that's where we jumped over in January. That's where our backup was. You can see that was the previous high here. That seems pretty important. And then if you come to the current time frame, it is kind of where we bounced before we had that big drop. So that's one possibility of where it is. I think it's a decent one. The other one is above it, and this one's kind of boring because it's like super tight. I think it's this one. It's the only other place I can see, like right before the March drop in 2020, we had this kind of support that was built. That's the support that's tested repeatedly. It hits it again in the backup right here in January. You can see that's the first level it hits, and then it goes down to the next level. It looks like it's about 50-50 between the other two, and then that's where we hit a bottom in January of 2023. Does that make sense? So you can see that's pretty clear. And that seems to be the level we were sort of finding support on until that big upthrust, and then we wrecked through it. We gapped right over those first two and hit the bottom one, and we never recovered. So it's kind of a weird guessing game, and I don't really want to play the game too much, but I would say that that's fair. Like that'd be a fair way to analyze these two and say they're somewhat similar. So the next one would be, we're just going to make a horizontal roughly there, and that makes sense. There's nothing really we can gain though from this other than this first push. So one of the things that's challenging about any kind of comparison, again, is sort of like, all right, how far can we take the comparison if it's not the exact same? And this one, I think there's two marks. Thanks for saying that, Mark. Appreciate it. I want to do a good job, so I'll try to do my best. So this particular, I know this is just comparative stuff, but I think it's cool and it's kind of important. So these two markers coming down would probably be the ones I would pick out. And to me, like that just represents like the downward creek. You can tell that in this particular time period, there was a lot of pressure going down. We were not advancing. So this could be thought of as like a flag. I remember back then everybody thought it was like a bear flag, and it was going to have this like massive breakout, and it ended up never coming higher than really this particular bottom here. My chart's getting a little cluttered, but these are really the only lines we need. So we don't need this bottom one. So you see how like this reads at first as like a downward flag. And then when it breaks out, it comes back up, and where does it go? It goes back to retest the level that we just didn't really check, which was the previous support where we had bought and sold so much up in like $60. If y'all, I think that was where it was. It was before it dropped from the 60s and went down to the 30s. It came back up to like 52 or something and just never came any higher. I would say that this seems to be what this M cross is built on. So again, if I'm trying to do my best to sort of get a picture of where like that may be, there's a challenge here in that our comparison is kind of breaking down because we were using this to compare the bottom. And you can't like magically say, oh, it's this line when it really was down here. it would be us coming all the way back up to like 227, which is kind of crazy. And it would be not nonsensical. It's more like, I don't think that that's necessary. We've already had a lot of checks. I said back in the day, I thought it was inevitable because even if this was a distribution, this is the original. Supply level way back. It's like 195 now. You can see that's the original supply level. And it looks like a giant widening almost. And I thought, if you're going to come back up and redistribute, a UTAD doesn't have to go above. That's the tricky thing, right? It doesn't have to go back above at all. There's no requirement that says it has to go back above that original supply level. But even if it were distribution, I would expect it to try. I think we did already do a lot of that. And this is a massive schematic, so it's hard to justify it, but sure. You could look at this and say, yeah, I think it's going to break out and then eventually go up there. And I've made that case too, that it seems possible, that you could get this very large kind of M-cross setup. The thing is like, okay, let's say you get that. This is how long it would take. It'd be like years down the road. There's no way proportionally you could make a case that this would take like an inordinate amount, or a very short amount of time, I should say. Like, there's no way for me to measure this where it doesn't take a long time. So in the event that, let's say, for example, even if you thought like we should measure from here, in the event that you wanted to measure it that way, that's fine. I just think that ultimately, like, it's kind of like, what's the point? It's way down the road. I don't think it's going to be short term. Like, there's no way to do it where it makes a lot of sense as a really fast move. Maybe you could go from here to that up thrust and say, look, I think it's basically from this point to the bottom to where that up thrust is. That's one I've gotten more than once. I'm 100% positive about that. So that seems to be a very common pattern here. I talked about this last time, but this here to here and then here to here is the same distance. And it seems like that's a common pattern amongst these bottoms. Because I remember we found that like at least once or twice a couple weeks ago. So what does that mean? Okay. That doesn't mean anything great. It just means that you have a lot of time on your hands, basically, to wait. It's still like a really long amount of time. Like, it would be from here way out. This wouldn't even be farther. You'd be talking about probably 2027 to 2028. If I remember right, we did the same measurement before. It's pretty similar. That could be good news for some people because they might not care about time and they see it as opportunity to make more money and to like advance. One other thing we would want to do is, I'm not going to use this red line. I'm going to do another one because I need to do a different one and keep that one up there. But this is one thing we could do, is use this as a guide. I'm going to do a lower red line. That could be very similar to what we see here as the main creek. Like, okay, maybe we do get this massive move right here eventually, and it happens way later, right? Maybe there is this like huge squeeze. It's the biggest move we're ever going to get. But the problem with this is it doesn't happen until years down the road. So how do you get there? Well, this would be a decent roadmap for us to use. So this would tell us that you're probably going to have this big move. This is really similar to the other charts I've made because, again, like, this fractal appears everywhere. And it's one that, I don't know, it varies like a little bit, but it's pretty consistent. Yeah, so basically the first challenge here is getting back above that original low. I think that is a challenge. It doesn't necessarily have to do it on the first go. In this case, it dips back down again. So there's a really strong reaction that occurs, really strong. It comes all the way back up to arguably $27. But then it falls all the way back down, and probably does like a 786 retrace or something, back down to 5. And then it does it again all the way up. And this time it just advances a little farther, and it would go all the way to $40. And then this is really where you come back down to like 9 or 10, and you would finally meet that middle here, right there. And this is where you would actually have that bigger takeoff from 30 all the way up to like 170. Does this make sense in the grand scheme of things? It might. If I look at this like a sine wave, I think that's what we were doing on the other week. If we looked at this as a giant wave and waveform pattern, you can see the similarities. That, all right, let's say, for example, it hits bottom. We're really close to it or right on it. We're close enough. We're just going to measure from roughly right where we are. It'd still be way later, potentially by the time it gets up there. I think that it doesn't match the 50% line, so we probably would need to do it a little differently. What's up?
I want you to come see my wave.
Oh, I can't. I'm not going to stop right this second. You can show me later. Don't worry. This actually is really close. Do you see this? So I went from the top of 397 all the way down to the bottom that we just had, which is basically like 230, okay? Notice that that's like that 50% mark. We've been talking about that a lot. We've been talking about that a lot lately. That's a pretty strong case that we may actually have hit like the official bottom. Now you could come down again and come lower than that, so you could double dip down here. But let's say, for example, it doesn't ever break that line. Like you could come low to like 220s, or shoot, even if it took a while, you could probably get down to like $2 or something if it came down later, like in July. But even if it did that, if it doesn't break that line, it's really close to bottom. This would imply that you get back here way over here. Like if it were to go up to like 201, dude talks way too much. If I didn't talk, you wouldn't, you'd just be watching somebody poke around on a chart. Hey, all I'm doing is showing you like, this is the way that it boils down to on a comparison, okay? And what I'm doing right now is, for example, if this is a sine wave, a massive sine wave, you would take the measurement from A to B, and then it would be again A to B. And that happens over the course of like time, right? It would basically take a really long time, but you could get up there. It's a really similar target too. If you look at that target, it's 179. So the target that we're coming up with in both cases is back to this top level, essentially, or very close to it. I mean, it's a region. It's probably like where this broke down right here long time ago, back in 2017. It's probably that fabled $21 that I used to bark about all the time. Everything's pointing to 21. Everything's pointing to 21, and I think it probably was. Does that seem too far? Kind of. I think it seems like a really long time. Because again, like most of the time on AMC during the moves up, they're pretty fast. But if this took any of these could take a really long time. I mean, you can see how like I've drawn it really tight. But if I draw it like really, really loose, there's really no reason why this can't take that long. I mean, it's frustrating, but there it is. I mean, it's not hard to draw it like that. So it's just lines on a chart, right? This is 2027. That kind of lines up a little bit more with what Adam Aaron said, which was he was expecting like a 5-year thing. So from the time he started talking about it, I don't know exactly when that was. I'll just go like in the middle here and say it was during the middle of COVID. A 5-year plan would take us at least to 2025. But you notice how like 5 years from 2025, that's kind of like the exact same level that we were at 5 years ago. So could it be that this is like indeed like a wraparound kind of thing? Yeah, sure. I don't know. Rotational symmetry happens all the time on fractals, and it's just, it sounds really weird and like hokey, but if you think about it, it's not really that complicated because bears and bulls have the same trading patterns, they're just in reverse. And that's why when you flip a Hycroft schematic, it pretty much looks the same. You know, like it just turns into different names, but they're almost identical. It's like upside down cat ears. So what you could do is like flip it and mirror it. It's gonna look silly though. That's always how this stuff works. Yeah, man, you can't do it. I don't know. Can you guys tell what I'm doing, or is it like too hard to tell? Okay, so what I'm gonna do is get rid of these extra ones. They're probably too hard to tell. So one of them's $40. We'll just say 42. I need to keep that on there. The other one is down here at like 930 or 980. Let's get rid of that. We don't need that. And I'm going to keep this one. So this would be ultimately like where you come back to later. And 980 would be more or less like that first one, but it wouldn't be this guy. And it frankly could go way deeper than that. I mean, you could come way back down, but I think 980 is a big one. Yeah, so let's just do a quick. So what I'm going to do is like a quick rotational estimation here. Yeah, it'd be something like that. So it's pretty similar. This is a rotation around a line that's the same. So what I'm doing is I'm just doing a really simple, like, oh, there it is. You know, it's not super complicated. I think you can understand that. If you take it like around the hands of a clock, for example, and you just rotate this pattern and flip it on its head, that's what you get. So if you look at it upside down, it should basically look exactly the same, but flipped. Yeah, time moves weird. This would imply, if it's that kind of rotation, this would imply that you reach that pinnacle at the same time after we cross. So you'd go do that center mark. It's a little different because I'm not really concerned as much about where it is so much as when it is. This would imply that you could get there as early as March of 2026. Again, that 5-year plan kind of so this is a little different. So this says it's like down then and it comes up. That's like a bigger move. And we're talking about a comparison with a completely different fractal. We're not talking about a rotation. We're talking about this kind of thing, which is a little different. And to be honest, this to me right here looks a whole lot, this almost exactly like what we see happen after the March move. That's like this guy coming up, where it's like a little more slow and methodical. You see how it's like a walk up. And I remember this being really boring, but these were big moves. Each of these was like 50%. These would be huge. This is just an M cross. It's not complicated. You know, it comes up, comes back down, comes up, comes back down, and then it goes. Like it's creating a level of support and resistance, of resistance above it, and then comes down, gets a buy-in, and then pushes above, and then comes back down, and then uses it as support. And it's very similar to what I'm talking about here. It's almost exactly the same thing. So if you're wondering, like, you know, how are you doing these mental gymnastics? They're not mental gymnastics. Like it's a really simple idea. And especially if you look at something like this massive downtrend that we've established over the years, last 2 years, this makes a lot of sense. Maybe more so than just a move straight up. to the moon, which is what a lot of folks will do, because they'll grab the fractal from over here and say, well, that's what's going to happen. Maybe, it's not impossible. We could see a move like that and be right back to this trend by September of this year, November of this year. And should that happen, would I be super thrilled? I'd probably be more likely to think that this would then come crashing down, to be honest. But absolutely, yeah, that's possible. It's roughly the same amount of distance traveled. You just would never come higher than like 61. Ironically, that's kind of where we were way up here. It's almost like you're kind of returning to all-time highs, but you're really not. And then ultimately, like, that doesn't necessarily bode well, long term, for some kind of greater move either, because especially if you stop there and then start redistributing, you're kind of back in the same boat you were in, where you're just going to continue downward. And who knows at that point, we can always come in and pick out one that we like the best and say, that's the one we're going to do, and it's going to go way up here and yada, yada, yada. I will say this, that if you're somebody that's looking for this to be hyper bullish within the next couple of years, and we might do one more comparison on this, but I want to look at some other stuff too today. Let's say you were like hyper bullish on this over the next few years, and you said, nah, dude, I think it's going to go way farther than the previous all-time high, or way farther than 183. You can use some really basic geometry to determine maybe where that might be. So you can just draw a trend from that very first high that was made probably back in 2015, which didn't, when we pushed up here, that raises the creek. That's way up there. You can look at this as like a giant widening. And if that's the case, and it did do another move up, maybe you could get up here. I mean, $700 sounds ridiculous to me, but sure, it's not impossible, just unlikely. It seems improbable to me. I'm just being honest. It doesn't make sense for anything to do with the value of the stock. But neither did 72. So, I mean, it just didn't. It was way over its expected market cap. So, is it impossible? No. I just think it's not as probable. The other thing you could do is you could look at what I just did, which was that trend line. So what I'm going to do is get rid of some of the extra stuff here. We've been kind of looking at this with a bunch of different ideas. So I want to kind of narrow it down to just one simple idea here. You could look at it as I'll leave that creek and the other creek. You can look at it as just a trend. And if we do that, this is very simple. You've got, I know it doesn't look like it, but that was like the bottom. Maybe I moved it. What happened to it? It was definitely right a minute ago. Probably moved it. Wah, wah, wah. It was like the original low over here, and then this low from like way back over here. I don't know. I'm not going to be able to snap it at this scale. But it's like that. Let me do it again. We could look at this as just a very simple, like, all right, look, see, maybe we should just do downtrends instead of worrying about, all this other jazz that you're doing. Sure. And if that were the case, I would say, yeah, this downtrend was met. Mathematically, it looks good. It was right here on that rebound. It was the lowest point back in April 2021 after that reaccumulation started. So it goes back to the previous outermost point, you would say, in September 2018. That's, again, a way of understanding the creek is that it comes up. This is the highest. It comes back on that trend, and then it doesn't ever reach those highs again. So the creek retreats. And even back here, it doesn't kind of push it. But it does here, right? And then we could take that, drag it up to the all-time high, way up top. It's like 395.69. I don't know if that's 100% right, but We'll just do that. That's close enough. And again, this would tell you like, okay, in theory, if we had the exact same run or nearly the same run up that we had back then, how might that play out? I mean, it still, to me, looks like a giant M cross, you know? But there it is. So there's sort of your identical moves. And be like that. Sorry. I'm going to have to change it because there's no wicks on these. So does that make sense of everything? Sure it does. But this again is August of 2025. So, and then there's a possibility that looks like you get stopped here around proportionally, probably around this gap level. These are bars patterns. They're not perfect science. But it would be like a V recovery where you like have a V-shaped recovery almost, and then it comes up to probably here. That's about that 980 level. That's your 180 day moving average. So makes sense. The moving average might, kind of dawdle a bit just like it did before. I mean, it's really similar to what happened here with this drop and then that bigger recovery. So if you really want to get bullish about it, that's probably what I would look at. I know a lot of folks are going to look at it and say, dude, we don't need to do all this. And you might be right. We've already traded this region pretty extensively. You can see there's a huge amount of trading that's happened here. And we just mentioned that like on some of these other like fractal groups that we were looking at, there doesn't seem to be the same timing doesn't seem to always be the same. And I think a lot of it is based on how much you trade. Like during this, notice how long it took coming back up here, but that's because they're like buying, drop, buying, drop, buying, and then finally go. And when you came down in this particular setup, there's like no stopping. It just kind of drops straight down. So they kind of like cruise. So the areas that are traded, and this would be your VRVP kind of stuff, but the areas that are heavily traded are like here and up. You can see there's a heavy amount of trading done right there early on, and then there's a little bit more trading done right around this 208 marker. And so it makes sense that when you come back down that you would trade low for a longer period of time in this region here. So we could do something like, we have to do something like that in a similar way where we are now. And I think it's kind of obvious. You can see the massive increase in volume. And it's happening where? Like all of it's happening below, the previous bottom. So what are some areas that you could skip over? If I was to say skip over. Well, we couldn't skip over it back in COVID. In COVID, there was no trading done. It was purely selling. There was like no real trading done back and forth, no liquidity check. You can see here, this is it. It's just a drop. And so for the whole of that 10-month stint, you're then working through this range here and trading that area that had never been traded previously. Where did we jump over? Well, when we came down, where did we jump over? We jumped over that area that had previously been traded. So sort of like what we're seeing on these other ones, a lot of times that move, you're kind of just skipping past the stuff that you've already done, and you're going low to an area where you haven't yet traded. The challenge on this is going to be like how long, right? There's probably ways to somehow like retroactively determine what that should be, but even here you can see like this area was traded, it pushes up and then it drops below it, and then there's a time of quite a long period of time, and it's just really difficult. I think that somebody who's really good with PNF, maybe point and figure, which measures time versus price movement very specifically, would probably be able to determine maybe how much time is actually needed. I don't know. We could debate it. And then as more time passes, sometimes it's relevant again to like look at the chart and say, yeah, we wouldn't we would not stop there. It's been like years. I don't think the original operator's in the stock. In this case, I do. Yeah, that's correct. I agree. Yeah. I mean, these are what I would call cat ears, right? I mean, they're basically like this breakdown type move. It's just sometimes they don't go all the way through a full 100% S curve, like where this is like the halfway mark, in which case it would be down to $1. Instead, they stop short at some other trend and then they reverse. Again, we could debate like whether or not that's a valid way to describe something, but I think the point is pretty self-explanatory here. Like, it's not always cookie cutter. Like, if you do a lot more trading on the way down, that's what kind of happened here. You can see that this was a lot of chop. And I'm talking about chop because I'm not talking about like just buying or just selling. I'm talking about when there's back and forth trading. That's a liquidity discovery kind of methodology, right? You're going up and down a lot, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, especially with high volume until the volume's exhausted. Then a range is like satisfied. Or you may not come back to it for a while because they don't want shares there. They've already traded that area and exhausted the trading there. This is volumetric, I guess you could say, analysis that Hycroft provides. Is that's essentially the goal, is always liquid exploration. So it makes sense to me that right now we've been kind of going down, but also there's been a lot of buying because you have that period of choppy sideways action where you're going to sort of get that trade back and forth. I think we're seeing a lot of that. It's just happening over a longer period of time than we would probably like. So is it possible then that we skip a range like this? Maybe. I think that's a possibility. Let's check the VRVP. Blop. Yeah. So where would be the natural place to skip to? Probably $11. But we already sort of knew that because that's like back to the original place. The weird thing is that like you wouldn't necessarily need to trade there again. And there's a whole nother set of analysis we could do on these areas, which is the volumetric profiles. I think that, yeah, it's just hard to say, if that's going to be a huge determining factor. I think that right now what we're seeing is pretty evident top, middle range kind of stuff. Like you've got 1, 2 right here. So they've already given us trading, heavy amounts of trading where you would expect it. It's not rocket science. Here and here. I don't know. So how do you navigate that area? I mean, it is exactly kind of the way it looks. I think that there's a possibility that you spend more time trading areas or trying to trade areas that you haven't already, which is probably this range, and then ultimately this lower area. And this is what someone else said earlier. They said, I have a bad feeling we haven't hit bottom. Well, you might not be wrong, because if the goal is to sort of trade this area more, there's really nothing stopping you from running this up into earnings and then dumping it again to come back down and trade more. The only thing that would change that is if we had a succinct buy-in, if that makes sense. Now, some people are going to look at this and say, man, I think we've already done that. We're doing this right now. Sure. I mean, I hate to be a jerk about it because I know I'm a jerk. I get it. You don't have to tell me. I know what people are looking at. They're looking at this and they're saying, look, man, it's the same thing. It's just going down. Yeah, but I could say that about any fractal on here with that downward motion. Like, we just went through a bunch of them. I could take this back and say, well, I think this is the same thing, and it may not be, like, it may not end the same way. I think it's important to look at this as like a huge, big picture kind of analysis. And I don't think it's best to take just one comparison and say that's the one, it has to be that one, because we know why we want that. Like, we want that because it's this push up. But the truth is like that doesn't determine whether it happens or not. So do I think that this is a good bottoming area? Yes. Do I think that it has to be this immediate move up? No. I think there's a decent chance that if we didn't want to explore liquidity, we definitely we wouldn't need to go back through the $6 to $8 range very much. We wouldn't need to go back through probably this, I don't know, it's not really a big range, but $4 to $5. It's not surprising to me that those are basically like 50-50 moves. So $4 up to $5 or up to $8, halfway from one to the next. That's a good way to stair step your stock, is to already have those levels where you can kind of go in and like briefly trade high and then go in and briefly trade again. But it does not mean just because there's a similarity that they're exactly right. So I don't feel like, because I think the same thing was said back here, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, I looked at this area and I thought, man, it kind of looks similar to when we dropped in October. I said it kind of looks similar to 2021. But then I said the same thing because you get those double up through moves, and it's true, like that could end up playing out long term, something like that. But you could say the same thing about it also looking like the middle of December. And that was my big fear, was that, well, shoot, I mean, December does something really similar, but then it breaks down at the end. And they basically are identical. Why wouldn't they be? Both of them had distributive tops. One of them just had a buy-in at the bottom, and one of them had the lower spring, and then it dropped. Well, it wasn't a spring. It had an LSPY, and then it dropped. So it's not enough to just say, like, the fractals match. What I'm trying to do today is say, like, hey, here's what I think needs to happen in order for us to get that bigger push. I think there's a pretty clear and evident series of events that need to happen. We talked about earlier the big one. I think this is one of the biggest ones right here. I think we definitely have to jump this guy. And it's very critical. I also think that this is probably like the main downtrend, and that all of this business was just us deviating from it in order to kind of see if we could hold this trend. And we're just using this trend as a way of creating an LSPY, a last point of supply before a bigger drop. Now we're just resuming the same trend. Y'all, if we had never stopped here, let's say we had just kind of kept going down, this would all look like, like it's the same trend. I mean, it's no different than where we were at the beginning. So I don't find it to be super bizarre at all that we're kind of grabbing onto it. What I do think is that we need to get above it. And I think this is fairly consistent with what we see on the whole. If you go back to this area, this is like kind of that midway where we kind of gravitate up. You can do the exact same thing here. And you can see that the stock kind of runs away from, it comes up and then it drops down, it meets up again, and then it kind of gravitates under it and then eventually jumps it and then goes. And there's a big push up. We're kind of waiting for that jumps it and then goes moment where we get the jump and then we go. I'm of the opinion that it could look a lot of different ways. I think the jump might be this straight up move, but I think it could pretty easily be this drastic move that could even go lower technically. I think it could be more of like an accumulation move sideways before a push up, which makes a lot of sense to me because I've already been talking about the M crosses and how there's a whole slew of evidence that this probably, needs to jump these creeks, and that could take time. It could be near the end of the year when that happens, and I don't see why we would assume it has to be like now. I just don't see any reason for that assumption, especially with AMC doing what it is. So that's my thought behind it. Like, this doesn't feel any less bullish to me. It just takes longer. It seems likely, I guess, what I'm trying to say. Regardless, if I'm looking to just play like short term, I would say this is probably the bigger, more significant marker right now. There were two we looked at earlier. One is because we were looking at the other shallow S curves and we were just doing comparisons. We were saying like, well, you know, this is obviously a big one in play, you know, where you have that main downtrend on the shallow S curve. Once it jumps it kind of goes. Another one was maybe what we would say is like a more prevalent, you know, cross trend through here. This one is kind of interesting because this one actually looks like it parallels the outer one here. And you can see there's like an early cross here where it comes over and then jumps. Doesn't really matter to me. If you can make the argument it's either one, but both of them haven't been jumped. So like there's no there's no real reason to think like it has to be one or the other, but I do think that both of them haven't jumped. So we haven't jumped either of them, so it doesn't really matter. Probably the way I drew this, it would be more prudent to use the outer one here, which I already had on the chart, which is this one. Same deal, so it jumps it and goes. So in my opinion, like that's kind of the main point here is like you've got a pretty steadfast, simple way of looking at creeks anyways, and how these fractals have set the creeks up. I think it's pretty straightforward. This one's a little trickier. They really look like they're basically in the same spot. Maybe it is lining up to try to be like an earnings move. My thing is always like doubting the earnings move because it hasn't always worked out for us. Yeah, I think I was using this guy. These are basically just cat ear lines. It kind of just takes me back to the same thing I've already been talking about forever. So, and I talked about ChargePoint. It's bizarre how similar the two stocks are. Maybe a good idea to try to do it here and just see what happens. Because maybe there's some similarities that we could point out. So this one comes from September 2021. They're eerily similar. Like they're super similar. Yeah, I don't know. Is that how you describe it? It's that marker. It's close, but maybe no cigar. This is weird because this one kind of goes all the way backwards. I don't know. Anyways, it's probably not of high interest to most of you, but it comes through the bottom in December of 2022 right there. Actually, that's pretty darn close. It's still very similar. It's still like tucked beneath it. It's interesting. Also interesting is HYMC and AMC have like basically come together in price. I think that's really fascinating. Really fascinating to me. They're almost touching now. I think that's really strange. Don't know exactly what it means, but I know they found a bunch of silver, like billions of dollars worth or something ridiculous. I didn't really read through it that much, so it's a grain of salt, but they look like they're moving almost opposite of each other from the March 24th announcement. It's kind of bizarre. Anywho. All right. IWM, kind of mixed bags, mixed feelings about this. So to be honest with you, I don't know if it's held the creek well enough. It looks like it's trying to. It needed to hold right here. So I knew way back that when we dropped, we were probably going to come down to this intersection. Here's the good news about IWM, is that if IWM can find its footing, I think it's going to end up at 216, probably by like mid-June. So if it can hold its footing here and keep this support, it should come back up and reach its natural top again. Should be up here around 217, right around end of May going into June. It's debatable. You could kind of stretch it out a little bit more, so it's more like mid-June. It's like a 2-week window, but I think it's pretty likely if it can find a footing here. This has happened before. This happened during COVID. There was a push up. It was like a decent double push, but there was a divergence. You can see the divergence on the RSI as it came up, kind of meeting itself and starting to die off, and then it has this big drop, this big back up, comes back into the previous range. Where we are right now is very, 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 very important. And I've been following IWM for a good bit now, but I started with, the focus was more on SPY at first, and I decided I should probably just flip over to small caps since most of my current interests lie in small caps. Yeah, I mean, in reality, like, I know this is insane. This chart looks really crazy. But this is what I'm talking about. Like, previously, this is what happened previously on IWM. You have a big push up. There's a double top. The volume kind of diminishes quite a bit. That's what happened to us here. The volume dropped down. There's a huge pullback to come back to the 4-hour 180 moving average. Once it reaches the bottom, it reverses. In this case, it basically forms like a perfect parallel with what was going on the top. It's not that it has to be perfect. It's just oftentimes if you get that kind of parabolic move and it breaks down, that's what happens. It's probably like almost a perfect 50-50 on this cross. That's the sine wave stuff we talk about. And I think that's what happened here is we got a really close, if not perfect, 50-50. So if you're wondering, hey, does that sine wave stuff apply to other stocks? Yes. Like if you look here, that's the 50% mark. And if you had drawn a line from the previous top, you would have gotten where that sine wave is going on the pullback, assuming that it continues forward. Interestingly, on like the 1 hour, it's pivoted up quite a bit. It looks a lot like a wedge motion. I will say that if it's a wedge motion into what we'll call like a channel, it doesn't have very far to go up before it would then start channeling back down. So it could be that this is like a longer bottom. It might coincide with I have 180, you might have 200, but it'd be a similar hit here on that EMA. We'll see. It's got to jump that EMA anyways. I've got those levels marked off, 199 to 201. I think that's pretty much where that support and resistance is. And it makes sense because that's probably where we would end up meeting that moving average. My estimation was 194. So if you want to know how far off I was off by a few dollars. But the 194 hit is really darn perfect. I mean, it's like right there. So I feel it was like 193.50 or something. I feel like that was a really good estimation. And that has to do with that 50% cross. Like that's a real thing, apparently. I don't know. That's just something that I felt works really well on AMC. I tried it on IWM. There it is. It's probably a fib level or something too. We could always just look at basic stuff like that and say, all right, well, yeah, but it's, really it's a 786 retracement. Like, okay, I think math is math. It probably makes sense because of the angle of this sine wave that this would come back to a certain retracement. But I was mentioning a minute ago, I think this is a really pivotal level. I don't remember exactly when the next FOMC meeting is. I'll have to check. I feel like it's a little ways off. So I remember March, there was a gap. Yeah, you can kind of tell like where we are back in time. It looks like the previous support here. So I think this is a very important level that we came back and tested. Yeah, you can see it right there. That's your 191.45. Yep. And you can see why that would be really pivotal to have. If you have support on that, there really won't be any reason to not continue up, if that makes sense, because we've already traded all below, like for a year, I mean, plus. So, I mean, we've been down here for the whole time. In my opinion, there's one of two options. Either this is going to break down and just drop all the way through this range, which seems really unlikely to me, although sure, it's possible. If it did do that, it would probably come all the way back down to like the 140s. That's the only other place I can see it going. Or it's finding support right now on that previous bottom from like way back over here. In which case, I think it's going to go up to meet first 217, then come up to like 227. So I think it'll hit 217, then it'll come up to 227. And if we continue to push, I could see it going all the way up to 250 something, maybe even 260 something, way up here. If you really look at the trends, there's no stopping it from there. I mean, technically IWM's trend, it could come all the way back up to 315. I mean, it seems silly, but we did this kind of move before. I'm not saying it's going to happen again. I'm just saying like that's what this move could be. We did almost the same move back in this push. This was like a, well, we'll go to the top. This is like a 62% move. So for us to do that kind of a push, though it may seem a little out there, I'm suggesting like it's a similar push. It's a 55% move. So for me, like, that's not way out of the question. Do I think it could get there really, really soon? Honest to goodness, this looks to me like it's. I know it sounds crazy, but this is like a 50% line. You know, I was just talking about those like 2 seconds ago. This is like a 50% line, and I went, and I don't remember exactly how I measured it. I think I measured it here to here. This bottom to this bottom. This is like the 50. This measures out to be basically the election. So if IWM can find its footing right now, I don't see why it would trade this middle area very much at all. I think you could see it. I honestly think it's possible. I know it seems crazy, but I honestly think it's possible this could move from like 194 all the way up to like 317 by the end of the year. I know it seems crazy, like that would never happen. It's a market squeeze is what it is. Well, we just did one of these and it was way bigger, technically. Like it was a even farther market squeeze from COVID. So I think we're in this period of like pullback right now where the market's like taking a breather, it's slowing down. That being said, what about the S-curve? There is an S-curve way of measuring this, which is to look at that as like a 50% marker. That does not give you as big of a move at all. It only takes you up to that 230, which also makes sense because that's kind of the point that I was saying is like, all right, well, if we didn't make it all the way there, where would we go? We'd probably come back to this previous top, this previous supply level, which is oddly, right? Not oddly, right? It's just math. It's like a 50% move. So we went up, we're coming back down. That's the 50% at 191. Then we push up again and you make it, and that finishes the S-curve. That one's a little different. I don't know. I don't know if I could do a better way of estimating that. I don't have, S-curves are bizarre and they kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? They're kind of hard to measure, I guess, because they don't, like you know what it looks like visually, but to find those points, it's always, it feels very made up, like imaginary. Like I can just imagine, and then you don't really have any surefire guess. Does that make sense? Like I think this is probably the S curve, but you're left kind of like, I don't know, maybe. I know that's the 50% mark, and it seems to work out because that's how it should measure out where this finds support. If it finds support at 191, you can get a secondary push up to 227. But beyond that, it's sort of lost on me. Like I don't really know what to pick out. I will say this: if, for example, the move is similar to the first one, you can do like a trend line from bottom to top here. And a lot of times that second move, if the S curve is kind of symmetrical, will be somewhat similar. So depending on when this moves, you could get a move that's fairly symmetrical, meaning like it's parallel, not symmetrical. It's just geometry stuff. It does happen to be that way quite often. Same thing happened over here. You can go look at it. So if you're wondering like where are you getting that kind of stuff from, you just take that move and you say, all right, well, after they took a breather, was the next move pretty similar? Yeah, it was pretty similar. It actually looks a little less intense, maybe. Like it looks like it was a little less dramatic. But if I nudge it over a little bit, it's similar. It's not exactly the same. So this is what I mean by S-curve. I don't really know a better way to describe this kind of motion. I will just say that like that 50% is a little just difficult in my mind to, I don't know, determine, I guess. When does it actually take off? How long does that take? When you only see half of it, it's tricky, you know? This kind of makes it seem like if we did the same comparison, that this should be back over here. We should be using this 50% marker because that's what I could have done here and I didn't do that. And that could be like where it's just an estimation. That could be where that S-curve's downward motion is happening. Back to the 50%. That gives me a decent estimation of timing. It's not the best. It's decent. Yeah. So that would be like us going up here and then pulling this back. Trying to do it the same way. This is on this other kind of rising marker here. That's interesting. I wonder what that is. I don't know. I don't remember why I drew that. Maybe we can find something similar just so we can get a better measurement. It's this like halfway intersection, but it's clearly being used. Some kind of a major trend. Probably comes back to like 2008 crash or something. That's my guess. I'm not seeing anything that looks like that. I guess it would be here and then here. Yeah, this is the 50% on this move. It actually comes up here, but this is where it finds support. So where's that going to? Looks like nowhere. I might think of it more of like an anchor line, like the stock price is kind of anchoring along this trend. They had a trend, the market had a trend here for a while. It tried to hold it back in 2023. It was sort of a loose trend. I don't think it's the best. It might be that guy. It's even a little bit steeper. Sure, either one. That one's a little better. So this goes all the way back to the bottom in, what was that, October? It makes more sense. That would be a very smart place, since this is a trend up, to anchor yourself. It matches the trend here presently. It's the same angle. Yeah, this is giving me a decent way to kind of box it in. So if I take this back down to this trend, this back up to this trend, shoot, I don't know. I could just play with it from there. It doesn't really help me though. Let's see how far this goes. No, that's the right spot. Seems like July. So my guess would be that you could have some sideways action and then like something happens, you know, there's going to be some kind of a rebound and then it would come up here. The last push would probably be bigger. This would be your first creek jump, I think. The local one. See that downtrend? It breaks out that downtrend, does a quick retouch, comes back up here, reestablishes strength back above 200, pushes up again. This is like a fib fan type deal where you go from previous top to the current tops. And that's where you would have some kind of an SOS right there, just across from it. Yeah, and then that's like a 50% mark cross for that. So then you have like a clean from like 208 up to the top. You have basically a clean 50-50 from 208 up to 227. What I'm talking about is like the 50% is now apparently like this upward trend on this flag looking thing. It makes sense. The more you stare at the market, the more you start assuming that that's probably what's going to happen. Like it will make sense. Like it will have some kind of a mathematical certainty to it. People like clean numbers. Again, all of this has to be that we hold in like the 190s here. You cannot have it break down here. If it breaks down here, it's bad news. Bad news. Yeah, this seems pretty likely to me. You could even have like a really massive push to like 216 and then it pulled all the way back to like 208 or something and then go again. Yeah, you could have it be this kind of like a widening or something like as it's going up. Market volatility increasing. Seems likely. All right, well, the comparisons we did today were just comparisons. They're not meant to give you like a perfect one-to-one. In fact, there is no perfect one-to-one because there just isn't. AMC is ultimately the macro, the big picture on AMC is what's determining that these micros look certain ways. So you got to be careful with saying it's going to ever look like a micro fractal. Micros make up the macro, remember that, and they're reflecting what's going on the big picture. If on the big picture you're doing this big pattern distribution, it's often the way you'll see it trade on the smaller picture. But to go back and reverse and say this is what's going to happen because, you know, I see it on the micro, that's kind of, it's a mixed bag. You know, I've had some successes with that. I've had some pretty obvious failures with that. Sometimes it's led to like really awesome trades. Other times it's been kind of a huge miss. So I don't find it to be super reliable. I think that right now, just like before, we were kind of pushing over this creek and we just couldn't hold it. And I think what we're really waiting for is to get over it. So at this point, I wouldn't say anything is definite until we pass above maybe this 370 level, but it seems to be that that's kind of one of the clutch levels. Like if we're going to reject maybe into earnings or something, maybe it happens there. If we're going to find support, maybe it happens there. Does that make sense? And I'm guessing with earnings around the corner, it's already closer than the previous one. We are from May 24th. It's not that far. It's a month away. You might think that, like a month is too far. We're definitely going to fly. And And you never know. We took about 30 days during the January move, but most of our moves have been at least, 2 to 3 weeks. Is it possible that we have a big move? Sure. It's also very, 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 very possible that we are going to hit this and bonk our heads and redistribute down and come back down into earnings. Like this is not set in stone. And I don't think either one is necessarily bad, because if this happens, it's not the end of the world. It could just mean that we need to then make another M cross, and this is just taking a little longer than we want, but its end result could be very, very similar, right? Especially if we go ahead and knock out the trading in this lower range, it's a very good case for not coming back here later. It creates a much stronger case than just taking off and never really trading this area. So to me, like, either one makes sense, and I would not be super upset to see it come back down into earnings, maybe even make a new low. Like, that's totally possible here if it did come back down. And then, a takeoff could be very simply just that. And at that point, we talk about these things like nonchalantly, but that is a huge move. That's a 300% move. And you definitely could turn that into some serious money. And that's the 980 move. We're not anticipating it necessarily going way beyond, but if it did, it would probably come up to just above 11 or something, or back to that gap at $10. From there, my expectation is, once again, that it's probably going to go back down and try to get some liquidity again. You could either find support at 7 something way up here and just continue, or we could see it dive and do about a 50% retrace. It also seems possible. 50% retrace going up to $12 takes you right down to this low liquidity area around 555. So it would not be a make or break kind of thing if we drop back down. And that to me seems very possible, if not probable. That would be like your jump for reaccumulation potentially. And then your second move, I don't know, man. This is where stuff gets kind of weird. It's hard to say. If we end up making the big push all the way up to 40 something, it could be really, really big. But I think that the second move may not go way beyond, It could be very simple. I don't know. At that point, I'd have to look at the bigger picture again. I had a secondary target that was like $42. I think it's possible. And it would sort of echo the first move. But if that were to happen, could it happen going into November of this year? Yeah. The thing is like, that's really different than the other schematic that we drew. The other one we looked at was a very long-term accumulation. It doesn't ever go above 11, and then it goes lower later. It doesn't return back to this blue trend line again. That's kind of what happened here. It hit the blue trend line, had a strong reaction, and then came back down, went a little lower. And it's not out of the question. That could be the November move. November could be low. Completely the opposite. I really don't want it to... I know you guys are like sick and tired of back and forth stuff, but it really just depends on how we trade. I do think skipping over this area makes a lot of sense. So once we get up to this region, do I think we're going to like have a big squeeze moment back up to 42? Yeah. And 5 to 42 is nothing to stick your nose up at. That's a big move. And we could see that as a kind of a halfway point too. It's possible. That's more of a stair-step approach to this whole thing. It's like this. And if you're looking at that January fractal and you're thinking, nah, I don't think it's going to do that, you probably are thinking that this is going to distribute, come back down. And this is where we get to like a new low, maybe around 2. And then it's a much faster move. It's just a completely different route. But I'm just throwing out stuff that we're doing based on the comparisons we saw today and the levels that make the most sense. And thankfully, we're getting much the same that we were on the sine wave, which is, coming back to these places that you have a pretty common ground. Like everything seems to kind of point back to these particular levels. They're common sense levels. We've got a big gap up at 42. It makes sense. 91, 93 would be technically, it's not as high as we were before, but sure. If it's a UTAD, if it ends up being a really large distribution over time, that could be a UTAD kind of moment where you kind of just create a giant hook and then you drop again and then you start downward. If it's a change of character, then this should be like a spring-like action. And much like what we see on the big picture, remember we looked at a couple different schematics. This is where I would go back and say, yeah, in the grand scheme of things, if this ends up being kind of like some of the other ones we've seen, you could definitely have a much larger schematic at play here, and that could be like 42 up to, this could just be one step of a huge amount of push, back to some kind of all-time high way in the future. But I think that's way down the road. Like way down the road. I'm personally like looking to get all my averages below 30 to 40 at this point. If I haven't already, I've really haven't looked in a little bit, but I think I got a lot of them really low. Honestly, I'm kind of just as excited about playing something like IWM. I do think this is a good setup, I think that there's a little bit of uncertainty for me about going into this next month. I don't feel confident about saying it's about to run or whatever. I think the buy-in here is encouraging. I think that the push back up is really encouraging. I think it's a very squeeze-like move, so that's good. I don't necessarily think it means that it has to keep going forever. We've seen this kind of move. We had a 40% move, I remember, in like 1 hour in May, and it did top off and come back down. You don't know until you know. So for me, I'm waiting for this kind of major creek jump to happen. And quite simply, I think it's fairly self-evident. We've talked about this all morning, but I think it's right here, Like this is pretty much where it's at. I don't feel like it's that complicated. So I think if this kind of jump happens, it's a better place to buy. There's a lot more confidence. And until then, you're kind of just waiting to see what happens when it hits that creek and that resistance. Do sellers sell off? Buyers just break through and go? Yeah, it's hard to say. And frankly, I don't mean to sound like condescending or anything. That's not what I'm saying, but unless you're like an operator and you're the one driving this stock, you buy here because you want to buy here. You don't buy here because you think it's a good value from here to here, And you're defining a range perhaps that you're going to trade in, but operators and those smart money institutions, they don't buy in to try to catch bottoms like the way that we think about it, like, oh, I got the best price possible. They're really doing stuff to explore liquidity, and once they determine that the price is going to move up, that's when the bigger buy-ins happen to drive the price. And so most of their buying happens at the end. That's not really a theory at all. It's fact. You can go look at volume profiles, and most of your volume is in those bigger moves because that's where they're saying, all right, we're moving up, we're moving down. And the markup periods are the places where you have, I guess the most amount of smart money buy-in, but specifically like SOSs, places where it jumps a creek and then there's an SOS, like a sign of strength. That's where you're going to get a lot of buy-in. So you might be an eager beaver and say, like, I don't really think that you're wise to wait, Booksy. You should get in now or something. But that's not the way I trade. I'm more likely going to get in if I see something like this. You know what I mean? And honestly, even if I only caught this part of the trade, that's a huge move. And I don't see that as a bad thing. As opposed to getting in and then watching the price drop and then you know. So coming back up to 350s isn't exactly odd to me. Like it seems pretty straightforward. Coming back up to retest this level that we had support at. We'll see what happens. Maybe it holds, maybe it doesn't. If it does hold, I mean, if it pushes up, it pushes up. Once it breaks this creek and holds support, cool. But you got to remember, like, we did the same garbage on the last two earnings where we had these big pushes up and then they ran up into earnings and then they just like let it die after, and there was some offering announced. So yeah. Anywho, all right. Well, the only other comparison I was going to do was probably not, there's no point that I've already done it. We did a little bit of IWM. IWM just really has to find support here and then hold. It doesn't really matter if it comes down a couple times. It just needs to kind of stay above that 191. And or if it has a spring there, it needs to quickly recover. I think if it has that support, we're in a pretty prime position for takeoff. RSI has been reset up to the 4 hour. I mean, it's basically there. So that doesn't mean it has to go up. It's just an observation of possibility. You know, this isn't a downward motion, so that's not the best, but I think we could see that breakout up on higher timelines. I know it's a messy chart, but this is the previous bottom from way back in 2020, 4 years ago. So I think we need to make sure this is support, and then we can probably go. It's like a back test. Yeah, I didn't talk about HYMC at all. To me, it's now trading above its moving average on the daily. I'm not huge into this stock, but if it did continue, we'd need to sort of hold support above like 295, this area. And it makes some sense. It's basically like the previous floor. So if you go back and you drop a line around 295, you know, it's basically right where that EMA is. So if it did come back down, it just needs to hold. Once it jumped a creek, then you might see a continuation upward. And it's long term, I think it jumped over like one of its biggest downtrends. So again, it makes sense that the EMAs would be very similar. Yeah, it kind of like pushed up against it, and it looks to me like it hasn't quite gotten there yet. Sort of early rejection here. It's kind of freaky, isn't it? How like it lines up with the AMC chart. With the January move. Isn't that weird? I think that's really weird. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to head on out. So I talked for a few hours. And got some other stuff I want to do today. So I do think AMC's a really good buy right now. I mean, I'm not a financial advisor. I can't tell you what to buy or sell. But, you know, anywhere down here is good. I've been saying the same thing since we hit sub $6. I mean, I really do think that it's a decent value long term. I don't, though, believe in the short term huge payoff necessarily unless we get these big jumps that we need. I just don't think we're there yet. It's not confirmed. So therefore, I can't say, yeah, it's confirmed. It's not yet confirmed. It just hasn't. Once it does, I'll be very happy to be like, yeah, it jumped it, it's holding, it's going, you know. But I just see this as like a double creek, you know, it hasn't gotten there yet. I hope you all have a good one. Take care of the people that you love. We'll talk to you all later.